There was a moment when the Rolling Stones stopped being just a band and started being treated like a warning. Not because of one song, because of a story that kept getting darker every time it was repeated. Whispers backstage, rumors that sounded too specific to be fake, nights people described like they didn't fully make sense. And the more that story spread, the more the world started asking the same question. What happened? Because this isn't really about music. It's about what a scared crowd does when it finds the perfect symbol to blame. And if you're coming here straight from the last video about Lennon, here's the connection. Lennon was treated like a threat because power feared his influence. The Stones were treated like a threat because the public feared what they represented. One was pressure from above, the other was panic from the crowd. And in some ways, the second one is harder to survive. So let's go back to the beginning, before the devil headlines, before the scandals became evidence, back when the Rolling Stones were just a band discovering one dangerous truth. The Rolling Stones did not begin as a satanic legend. They began as a simple provocation. A band that looked a little rougher, sounded a little dirtier, and smiled like they enjoyed the fact that adults didn't approve. And in a calm culture, that would have stayed where it belongs in music. But the late 60s were not calm. People were already afraid of how fast the world was changing, afraid of youth culture becoming its own nation, afraid of drugs, sex, protest, and the feeling that authority wasn't trusted anymore. When fear is already in the air, it does something strange. It starts hunting for a symbol. It wants a face, a name, a villain that makes the chaos feel explainable. And that is why the Stones were the perfect canvas. They weren't the first rock band. They weren't even the first controversial band. But they understood something early that most people don't want to admit. Image is not a side effect of fame. Image is a weapon. If you can make people talk about you, you don't just sell records. You shape the room you walk into. You control the temperature. At first, the danger around them is simple and almost childish. They are framed as the bad boys compared to the cleaner, safer faces of pop. Their look is messy, Their attitude feels less polite. Their music carries that swagger that makes parents tense up even if they can't explain why. The story becomes easy for the public to digest. One band is good, one band is bad. People love that kind of clarity. But clarity is addictive, and it rarely stays small. Because once the public learns to label something as bad, it begins searching for evidence to confirm the label. A lyric becomes a confession. A costume becomes sign. A rumor becomes a fact because it fits the story people already decided to believe. And the Stones, whether intentionally or not, kept feeding the machine. There's a difference between rebellion and myth. Rebellion is what you do. Myth is what people think you are. And myth is stronger because myth doesn't need your permission. It doesn't need to be fair. It only needs to be entertaining. The Stones were stepping into a moment where the culture was obsessed with extremes. Not just different, but dangerous. Not just new, but corrupting. That's what moral panic does. It turns normal change into a threat. It convinces people that a song is not a song. It's a trapdoor. And the press learns quickly that fear sells better than nuance. This is where the satanic angle starts to appear, not as a single invention, but as a gradual stain. A headline here, a whisper there, a dramatic interpretation of an album cover, a phrase taken out of context, a suggestion that the band isn't just rebellious, there's something darker. The moment you give a story a supernatural edge, you make it harder to argue against. Because you can't disprove vibes. You can't disprove a feeling. You can't disprove a parent saying, I just know it's evil. That's the genius and the danger of satanic panic. It isn't built on evidence. It's built on anxiety. And the Stones, to be honest, weren't exactly running away from the shadow. They flirted with it. They played with it. Because on the surface, it's brilliant branding. If the public is going to fear you anyway, you might as well own the fear and turn it into mystique. Turn it into tickets. Turn it into legend. But when you do that, you are gambling with the public's imagination. Because the public doesn't stop at edgy. The public escalates. If you give them a devil-shaped silhouette, they will draw on the details themselves. They will decide you're recruiting their kids. They will decide you're poisoning culture. They will decide you're the soundtrack to everything they don't understand. And once that belief spreads, it becomes contagious. This is also where the groupie mythology begins to fuse with the darker narrative. Not the boring reality of human relationships and fame, but the story the public loves to tell. The story of young women falling into a glamorous underworld. The story of secret parties, lost innocence, manipulation, danger. Some of it is exaggerated. Some of it is real. But here's the key. The public doesn't care which is which when the story already satisfies a fear. If you're a parent reading a headline at the time, you don't see a band. You see a doorway. You see a world your child could walk into and never come back the same. And whether that's fair or not, it's powerful. It makes people feel like the stones aren't just entertainment. They're a risk. Meanwhile, inside the band's orbit, the incentives keep rewarding the myth. Controversy makes attention. Attention makes money. Money makes more access. And access attracts more chaos. It becomes a feedback loop where the band's identity and the public's projection feed each other until it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. This is where our investigation starts to sharpen. Because the question isn't simply, did the Stones lean into a dark image? They did. The real question is, who amplified that image into hysteria? Who turned vibes into headlines? Who made rumors feel like warnings? And why did so many people want the story to be true? When you look closely, you start to see that the myth spreads for reasons that have nothing to do with spirituality and everything to do with power. The press gets clicks. Politicians get an enemy. Communities get a scapegoat. Parents get a simple explanation for complicated change. Even fans get something because it feels thrilling to believe you're listening to something forbidden. And the Stones get something too, at least at first. They get a reputation that turns them into more than a band. It turns them into an experience, a symbol, adare. But there's a line in every myth. At first, the myth is a costume. Then it becomes a cage. And eventually, if it keeps escalating, it becomes a danger. And that is the loop we're going to keep pulling on. Because the story you think you know, the devil headlines, the scandals, the warnings, all of it is only the surface. Underneath, it is a machine. A cultural machine that manufactures fear and calls it protection. A machine that can turn a band into a national threat without ever proving anything. A machine that spreads panic until the crowd starts acting out the story it's been told. And that brings us to the next chapter. Because once the myth is planted, the real question becomes how it gets built. How it gets printed, repeated, and upgraded until it feels official. How a narrative becomes stronger than reality. In the next section, we step into the engine of hysteria. The era that made the Stones the perfect symbol, and the media mechanics that turned rebellion into corruption and corruption into danger. The myth does not grow by itself. It needs oxygen. And in the late 60s, America was basically an oxygen tank for fear. Not because everyone was evil, but because everyone was overwhelmed. War footage on TV, political assassinations, protests, drugs, generation conflict. The sense that the rules were dissolving and nobody could agree on what the rules should be anymore. When a culture feels like it is slipping, it starts grabbing for something solid. And the easiest solid thing is a villain. That is how the engine of hysteria starts. It is not one person deciding, let's call them Satanic. It is 1,000 small decisions that reward the darkest interpretation. A newspaper editor choosing the most alarming headline. A TV segment framing youth culture like an outbreak. A local leader warning about moral decay because it makes them sound protective. A parent repeating a rumor because it feels safer than admitting they do not understand what their kid is becoming. And once that engine starts turning, it becomes self-sustaining. Because fear does something addictive to an audience. Fear makes people pay attention. Fear makes them share. Fear makes them feel like they are part of a mission. It is not just gossip anymore. It is a warning. It is not just a band anymore. It is a threat. That is the real role of the media in a moral panic. The media does not just report reaction. It trains reaction. It teaches people what to feel. It gives them the language to attach to their anxiety. Words like corruption, depravity, dangerous influence. Those words sound like protection, but they also sound like permission. Permission to judge. Permission to punish. permission to turn a concert into a crime scene in your imagination. And the Stones fit the archetype perfectly. They look like the opposite of what older America wanted to call safe. They were messy, sexual, defiant, unapologetic. And when you combine that with a public already terrified of youth culture, you get a perfect chemical reaction. The Stones become a symbol that can hold every fear at once. Fear of sex, fear of drugs, fear of rebellion, fear of the child who no longer obeys. Now, at the simplest but most powerful ingredient, repetition. A rumor does not need to be proven if it is repeated with confidence. It only needs to sound like something people have heard before. That is why dark myths spread so easily. They feel familiar. They feel like old warnings in a modern outfit. The devil has always been the easiest story to tell when you want to call something immoral without explaining it. And once satanic language enters the public conversation, it changes everything. Because satanic is not an accusation you can calmly debate. It is a moral alarm bell. It makes normal people feel like they must act. It turns discomfort into righteousness. It turns questions into certainty. This is why the myth becomes so dangerous. Not because it is true, but because it gives people a narrative that feels bigger than music. It makes them feel like they are fighting for their kids, their community, their faith, their future. That kind of emotional framing is almost impossible to compete with because it bypasses logic. You can show facts to a person who is afraid, and they will treat your facts as part of the threat. And the band is now trapped inside a feedback loop. Every time they lean into dark imagery, some fans see art and attitude, but the people already afraid see confirmation. Every time a crowd gets wild, fans see energy, but the fearful see evidence. Every time a story breaks about parties, drugs, sex, or chaos around the band, the myth gets another brick. Here is the part that matters, and it is uncomfortable. The public is not the only actor. Institutions begin to mirror the panic. Venues get nervous. Local authorities get pressure. Promoters start thinking about risk. Police presence grows, not necessarily because there's a real threat, but because enough people believe there is one. And once authorities show up like something dangerous is expected, crowds start behaving like danger is part of the night. That is how hysteria becomes real. The belief changes behavior. The behavior creates incidents. The incidents become proof. The proof feeds the belief, and the cycle tightens. This is also where the Stones become something more than a band in the public imagination. They become a test of control. Who decides what young people are allowed to idolize? Who decides where culture is heading? Who decides what is acceptable? When you frame a band as corrupting the youth, you are not arguing about music. You are arguing about authority. And authority loves battles that can be simplified, because the truth is messy. The truth would require admitting that the world is changing and parents feel powerless, and kids are growing away from old values, and society is struggling to evolve. That is hard to face. A satanic story is easier. It gives people a single cause, a single enemy, a single fix. Just stop the band. Just ban the concerts. Just warn the kids. Just name the devil and pretend the complexity disappears. Now, here's where the Stones complicate the story, and this is why the angle of this video is not anti-Stones or pro-Stones. It is about how a myth gets manufactured and what happens when the band starts interacting with that myth. Because the Stones were not naive. They understood provocation. They understood attention. And in a media ecosystem that rewards scandal, sometimes the fastest way to stay relevant is to become the story people already want to tell. If the culture wants you to be dangerous, being dangerous can feel like control, like power, like branding. But branding has a cost, because the moment you accept the myth as fuel, you are also accepting that you might not be able to turn it off. And there is a second cost, the human cost, the one that always hides under the glamorous surface. When a band becomes a symbol of corruption, the people around the band become characters in a moral drama. Groupies become victims or temptresses depending on who is telling the story. Fans become innocent kids or corrupted followers. Journalists become protectors or exploiters. Everyone gets turned into a role. And the more a culture obsesses over the role, the less it cares about the reality. That is why the next phase of the story is inevitable. Once hysteria is in motion, it starts searching for details to feed on. Not just vague vibes, but names, faces, scandals, confessions, anything that can be turned into a headline that feels like proof. So the myth expands into a scandal ecosystem. Stories about sex, about power, about young people in orbit, about nights nobody can fully verify and nobody wants to fully deny. And whether those stories are exaggerated or not almost becomes irrelevant, because the myth is already doing what myths do. It is absorbing everything and turning it into one message. They are dangerous. And now ask yourself this. If a culture is determined to believe a band is dangerous, what happens the first time something actually goes wrong? What happens when the atmosphere that has been manufactured finally meets a moment that cannot be spun? Because that moment exists in this story. And when we get there, you will understand the reveal. The point where the narrative flips from rebellious theater to something that looks like it's slipped out of human control. But before we reach that night, we have to go through the layer that made the myth feel personal. The layer that made it feel like more than headlines. The scandals, the groupie stories, the private chaos that the public turned into moral evidence. In the next section, we step into that world. The scandal engine that fed the panic, the ways the Stones benefited from the myth at first, and the exact point where it stopped being useful and started becoming explosive. Once a moral panic is alive, it stops feeding on ideas and starts feeding on people. It wants faces. It wants names. It wants stories that feel intimate enough to disgust you, or thrill you, or both. And with the Rolling Stones, that is exactly where the myth finds its most powerful fuel. Not in the music itself, but in the scandal ecosystem that grows around them. Because the truth is, fame is not only admiration. Fame is access, and access creates chaos. When you're the biggest band in the world, your life becomes a moving city of strangers, insiders, opportunists, and true believers, all colliding in hotel corridors and backstage rooms. Some people show up for love. Some show up for status. Some show up to get close enough to become part of the story. And in a culture already anxious, that story does not stay private for long. This is where the groupie narrative becomes more than gossip. It becomes evidence. To fans, it can look like freedom and glamour. To critics, it looks like exploitation and corruption. To the media, it looks like a goldmine. Because nothing sells moral panic like sexuality combined with celebrity. It is the easiest headline in the world. It lets people feel outraged while still consuming the story with obsession. And the most dangerous part is that the public does not want complexity. It does not want a nuanced reality where some people are adults making choices and other people are vulnerable, where power is messy and consent is a conversation and truth is never clean. The public wants a single narrative. This band is corrupting the youth. This band is dangerous. This band is a gateway. So every rumor becomes a brick. Every photograph becomes an exhibit. Every whispered story becomes a warning. Even when something is exaggerated, it is still useful. In a panic, usefulness matters more than accuracy. Now here is where the Stones complicate the story in a way that makes it feel almost inevitable. They understood the psychology of attention. They understood that outrage can be converted into curiosity, and curiosity can be converted into tickets. If the world insists you are the villains, there is a temptation to play the role perfectly, to lean into it, to make the villain look cooler than the heroes. This is where myth becomes branding. And branding works until it is not. Because when you lean into a dark image, you're not only attracting fans, you are also attracting the people who want to destroy you. You are inviting moral crusaders to treat you like a target. You are inviting journalists to frame every chaotic detail as proof of a bigger evil. You are inviting authorities to show up expecting trouble. And when enough people show up expecting trouble, trouble becomes part of the environment. That is how a myth starts shaping reality. It is important to say this clearly because it is the core of the angle. The danger is not that the Stones were secretly running some satanic operation. The danger is that hysteria turns normal human chaos into a script, and then crowds start performing the script. So the scandal ecosystem keeps expanding. Stories about drugs, stories about sex, Stories about nights that sound like they belong in a cautionary tale. Some of it is true. Some of it is distorted. Some of it is invented. But in the public mind, it all becomes one thing. Proof. Not proof in a legal sense, but proof in the emotional sense. The kind of proof that makes people feel justified. And once you are a symbol, the people around you become symbols too. The young women in orbit become characters in a morality play. Either they are painted as victims, or they are painted as temptresses, or they are painted as corrupted followers. Rarely are they treated as complicated humans. And that alone tells you what kind of machine this is. A machine that uses people as props to keep fear alive. At first, the Stones can surf this wave. Controversy keeps them everywhere. Every scandal makes the band bigger. Even condemnation keeps the spotlight on them. They become the band everyone argues about. And when you're the center of the argument, you are the center of culture. But then the wave gets taller, because moral panic always escalates. It cannot stay at a mild level. It has to keep raising the stakes to keep people paying attention. It starts with bad influence. Then it becomes corrupting. Then it becomes dangerous. Then it becomes evil. And once it reaches evil, it starts demanding consequences. This is where you see the shift in how the public talks. The language becomes less about taste and more about protection. It stops being "I dislike them" and becomes "they are a threat." That is the moment where a band is no longer just an artist. They are a public hazard. And the more the band is treated like a hazard, the more the environment around them becomes tense. Venues become cautious. Local communities become hostile. Police presence increases. Fans feel the pressure. Opponents feel empowered. Every show starts carrying an invisible question. Is something going to happen tonight? That question alone changes behavior. It makes people hyper-alert. It makes them emotional. It makes them ready to interpret any chaos as something bigger. It makes a crowd easier to ignite. And now, the Stones are in the most dangerous position an artist can be in. They are famous enough to draw massive crowds, controversial enough to draw massive fear, and mythologized enough that people arrive already convinced the night will be wild. That is a recipe, not for music, for a headline. If you're listening and you like this style of storytelling, where we take a cultural myth and show you the machinery underneath it, you will probably enjoy what we do here. We have a lot more stories in our playlists on stars from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where the public image is one thing and the hidden mechanics are another. And once you start seeing the pattern, you cannot unsee it, because the pattern is always the same. A myth forms. The media feeds it. The public repeats it. The institution reacts to it. And then one moment happens that turns the myth into something that feels real. And that moment is coming in this story. But before we reach the night where the narrative flips, we need to watch the panic become official. We need to watch how fear moves from rumor into policy, from gossip into security planning, from whispers into police lines and nervous promoters. Because that is the bridge between mythology and disaster. In the next section, we step into the escalation phase. The bans, the warnings, the pressure around shows, and the way the culture begins treating a Rolling Stones concert like a risk event, not an art event. And once you see that shift, you will understand how the stage was being set for the moment their myth finally turned dangerous. By this point, the myth around the Rolling Stones is no longer a vague feeling. It has shape. It has vocabulary. It has a tone that people recognize the moment they hear the band's name. And once a myth has that much momentum, it starts moving out of gossip and into logistics. This is the moment where fear becomes planning. You can feel it in the way venues and local communities start treating a Rolling Stones show like a risk event instead of a cultural event. Not simply a concert, but a night that needs extra security, extra rules, extra warnings. And what's terrifying about that is how quickly precaution can turn into prophecy. Because the moment you treat an audience like trouble, you build an environment where trouble is more likely to happen. The media plays a huge role here, not just by describing the band, but by framing what a Stones crowd is supposed to be. When headlines constantly suggest chaos, the public starts arriving ready to witness chaos. Fans show up expecting a wild night. Critics show up expecting proof that the band is corrupting society. Authorities show up expecting disorder. Everyone walks into the same space carrying a story in their head, and that story becomes part of the atmosphere. This is how hysteria becomes contagious. It's not just what the stones do. It's what people believe they will do. And belief is powerful enough to shape reality. When enough people show up convinced something is dangerous, they behave differently. They become tense. They become reactive. They interpret normal crowd energy as aggression. They escalate small moments faster. They treat the night like a test. And because the stones have become a symbol, every conflict around them becomes symbolic too. A scuffle isn't just a scuffle. It becomes a headline about moral decay. A bad decision by a promoter isn't just a bad decision. It becomes evidence that the band attracts danger. A wild fan isn't just a wild fan. They become the face of corruption. And because the narrative is already written, nobody waits for context. The story gets published first, and reality gets edited to match it later. Now, add the institutional layer. Once a band is treated like a public hazard, there's pressure for visible control. That's when you see heavier police presence, more security, more rules at the door, more public statements that sound like they are protecting communities. And again, on the surface, it sounds reasonable. But underneath, it's a sign that the myth has become official enough to affect decisions. This is where the Stones' own relationship with the myth becomes dangerous. Because the band's brand is still built on rebellion. They're not trying to be safe. They're not trying to be polite. Their image is still a dare. And that dare works as marketing, but it also turns every show into a psychological theater where the audience is invited to participate in the legend. The crowd doesn't just attend. The crowd performs. Some fans show up to feel liberated. Some show up to push boundaries. Some show up to prove they're not afraid. And some show up because they want to witness the rumor become real. That's the strange effect of moral panic. It doesn't only create enemies. It creates spectators. And the moment a crowd becomes a mix of believers, critics, opportunists, and adrenaline, the room becomes unstable. The press continues feeding that instability by treating the band like a cultural emergency. Not just a band with edgy aesthetics, but a symbol of corruption that supposedly needs to be contained. You start seeing the story shift from they are provocative to they are harmful, from they are rebellious to they are dangerous. For we dislike them to someone should do something about them. That phrase is the hinge. Someone should do something, because once a public believes that, the next step is action. Sometimes it looks like bans and cancellations. Sometimes it looks like moral crusades. Sometimes it looks like violence. But it always starts with the idea that a cultural force has become a threat that must be managed. And here is the most important psychological twist. The more the culture treats the Stones like a threat, the more the myth grows. Because suppression is a kind of proof in the public imagination. If authorities show up heavily, people think, see, it must be dangerous. If venues hesitate, people think, see, they must fear something. If headlines scream about corruption, people think, see, it must be real. Every reaction becomes confirmation. This is where the myth becomes almost unstoppable. Because the band doesn't have to do anything new. The culture keeps generating new evidence just by reacting. And the Stones, caught between using the myth as fuel and suffering from the myth as a cage, are now moving through an era where every public moment feels like it carries consequences. You can feel the tension building toward a breaking point. Not because someone plans it like a conspiracy, but because the environment is being prepared for it. When a show is framed as dangerous, when security is treated like a symbolic statement, when crowds arrive emotionally charged, it only takes one misstep for the night to spiral. And the scariest part is that no one will agree later on what caused it. Some will blame the band. Some will blame the fans. Some will blame the media. Some will blame the organizers. But the truth will be that the myth had been building a stage for disaster long before the disaster ever arrived. So here's where we are now. The Stones are no longer just a band with controversy. They're a band with an atmosphere around them. A kind of cultural electricity that makes every show feel like it could tip in either direction, ecstasy or chaos. And that is exactly when the reveal becomes inevitable. Because there is one episode where all of this collides. The myth, the fear, the performance, the crowd psychology, the institutional response, and the choices that were made behind the scenes. And after that day, the dark narrative around the Rolling Stones stops being metaphor. It becomes memory. In the next section, we go to that moment. The point where the story crosses the line from rebellious legend to something that feels genuinely out of control. The moment their myth turned dangerous. Every myth eventually asks for sacrifice. Not in a literal, supernatural way, but in a cultural way. A moment that turns rumor into memory. A moment that people can point to and say, see, this is what we meant. And for the Rolling Stones, that moment is the one that takes the story out of aesthetics and drops it into reality. By the end of the 1960s, the atmosphere around the band is already charged. You have a culture primed for panic, a media ecosystem trained to turn every controversy into proof, and a crowd psychology that has been taught to expect danger at a Stones event. And when you combine expectation with adrenaline, you create a night that is not just entertainment, it is a social experiment no one designed. Then comes December 1969, the Altamont Speedway Free Festival. On the surface, it sounds like something idealistic, a free concert, a massive gathering, the idea of community and music and a generation proving it can create its own world. But the reality of that day is messy, rushed, and volatile. The logistics were complicated, the environment was tense, and the security decision becomes one of the most infamous parts of the story. The Hells Angels were involved in providing security, and that alone tells you how different the era felt, how quickly a romantic idea could turn into something unstable when it meets real people and real risk. What happens next is the point where the myth flips. There is violence in the crowd. There are moments of chaos. And during the Stones' performance, a young man, Meredith Hunter, is killed. You do not need graphic detail to understand the impact of that fact. A concert, a symbol of culture, becomes a place where someone does not make it home. And once that happens, the conversation changes forever. The public no longer has to argue about whether the Stones are dangerous as a vibe. Now there's a real event attached to the narrative. This is why Altamont becomes more than a tragedy. It becomes a cultural weapon. Because remember what moral panic wants. It wants proof. It wants something that can be repeated in one sentence. It wants a moment that feels like a verdict. And Altamont becomes that moment. Suddenly, every headline and rumor from before can be retold with a new tone. People can say, we warned you, we told you, look what happens when you let this kind of band represent your culture. And the most disturbing part is how quickly the story turns simple. Because reality is complicated, but panic edits reality into a morality play. In that edited version, the Stones are not a band that played at a chaotic festival. They become the symbol of a generation losing control. The symbol of rebellion turning into harm. The symbol of a culture flirting with darkness and finally getting burned. Whether that is fair or not is almost irrelevant. Because once a society has a symbol, it will protect the symbol more fiercely than it protects the truth. Altamont also does something else. It exposes the hidden danger of leaning into the myth. For years, the Stones had been framed as dangerous, and the band had benefited from the aura, the bad boy reputation, the thrill, the forbidden edge, the sense that seeing them live was not just a concert, it was stepping into the myth itself. But a myth is not a controlled substance. You cannot measure it and contain it. When you invite people to treat your show like a ritual of rebellion, you are inviting the crowd to contribute to the chaos. And in a crowd, contribution can turn into escalation. That is where the line is crossed. The band's image, the media's framing, the public's expectation, and the event's messy logistics collide into something that no branding strategy can control. And once that collision happens, the Stones are no longer managing a persona. They are living with a shadow. Because from that point onward, every time someone says satanic panic, every time someone says corrupting influence, every time someone says they are dangerous, the band now has a real, tragic day attached to the story. A day that cannot be laughed off. A day that cannot be dismissed as prudish parents overreacting. A day that anchors the myth. And that is what makes Altamont the hinge. It changes the emotional physics of the entire narrative. Before, the myth was mostly projection. After, the myth has gravity. You can also feel how the culture uses this moment to shift the broader story of the era. People love turning messy decades into clean arcs. And Altamont becomes a convenient symbol for that too. The end of innocence, the end of the dream, the moment the 60s supposedly died. Even if history does not actually work like that, humans love a single scene that explains everything. Altamont becomes that scene. Now, here is where the story gets even more psychologically unsettling. Because once a tragedy happens, the moral panic does not calm down. It intensifies. Instead of asking what went wrong operationally, people ask what it means spiritually. Instead of focusing on practical failures, they focus on the myth. Instead of looking at crowd control, they look at symbolism. They turn a complicated incident into a narrative of corruption. And when a culture does that, it creates a dangerous incentive. It rewards the most dramatic explanation. It rewards sensational headlines. It rewards the idea that a band can be blamed like a villain in a movie. The myth becomes easier to sell than the facts. For the Stones themselves, this is where the myth stops being profitable in the clean way it used to be. Because a band can survive being hated. A band can survive being controversial. But being attached to a tragedy changes how people look at you. It changes how authorities plan for you. It changes how venues think about risk. It changes how crowds behave, because crowds remember stories, and crowds arrive already shaped by what they believe happened last time. This is also where the band's relationship with its own image becomes complicated in a way that is hard to fix. If you back away from the dark myth, people say you are guilty and trying to hide. If you lean into it, people say you are confirming it. The myth becomes a trap, a double bind, and that is what happens when branding becomes bigger than the humans inside it. So Altamont is not just the reveal. It is the point of no return. It is the moment when the narrative moves from rebellious to dangerous. Not because the music became different, but because the culture now has a real incident to attach to the fear. That is why, in the years after, the Stones do not just carry fame. They carry an atmosphere, a constant undertone of risk that follows them, even when nothing happens. And now we arrive at the question that sits under the entire video. Did the myth happen to them? Or did they help create the conditions for it, and then lose control of the fire? Because in the next section, we step into the aftermath, the way the band and the culture processed what happened, how the myth evolved, and why the panic did not disappear even after the facts were known. And most importantly, we answer the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most dangerous part of myth is not the story itself. It is what people do when they believe it. After a moment like Altamont, you don't go back to normal. Not for the band, and not for the culture watching them. Because the myth has been upgraded. It's no longer just a collection of rumors and aesthetics. Now it has a real scar attached to it. And scars change how people interpret everything that comes after. This is where the aftermath becomes more than cleanup. It becomes narrative warfare. If you're looking for the simplest explanation, it's tempting to say the Stones became dangerous. But the more honest explanation is more unsettling. The environment around them became dangerous. The myth, the media framing, the crowd expectations, the institutional responses, the logistics, all of it combined into a system where danger was more likely to happen. And once something did happen, the culture used it to justify the fear it already wanted to feel. That is how moral panic survives facts. It doesn't need to be accurate. It only needs to be emotionally satisfying. After Altamont, you can see the story split into two versions. There's the complex version, where a rushed event with unstable conditions and terrible decisions leads to tragedy. And then there's the version that spreads, the version people repeat at dinner tables and in newspaper columns. In that version, the Stones are the omen, the proof that rebellion has consequences, the proof that the youth movement has rotted, the proof that something dark is controlling the culture. The second version is a myth, but myths are sticky, especially when they carry a real death. This is where the satanic framing becomes even more powerful, because it offers a cosmic explanation for a human disaster. It lets people say this wasn't just bad planning, this was evil. And that language is emotionally addictive because it makes the world feel simpler. It turns complex systems into morality plays. It lets people feel righteous. And righteousness is one of the strongest fuels for hysteria. The band, meanwhile, has to navigate an impossible double bind. If they defend themselves too hard, they look guilty. If they stay quiet, the myth fills the silence. If they soften their image, they risk losing the edge that made them iconic. If they lean into the edge, they risk confirming the story. This is what happens when a persona becomes bigger than the humans inside it. You lose the ability to steer it. And here's the harsh truth. The Stones did not create the entire panic, but they did learn how to use controversy. They understood provocation. They understood the value of being unforgettable. They benefited from a culture that could not stop talking about them. But when you use a myth as fuel, you have to accept that the fuel can burn down the room. Altamont was the moment the room caught fire. The public, of course, doesn't analyze systems. The public looks for a verdict. And once a public decides you're dangerous, it starts collecting confirmation everywhere. Every scandal story becomes proof. Every rumor becomes evidence. Every chaotic fan moment becomes an example. Even when the facts don't align, the feeling remains. Because panic is not an argument. It's an identity. People want to feel like the world makes sense, and a villain helps the world make sense. So the panic continues. It shows up in how authorities plan shows. It shows up in how communities react. It shows up in how journalists frame the band, with a tone that suggests they're reporting on hazard. It shows up in how certain moral voices use the Stones as a cautionary symbol for youth culture. And most importantly, it shows up in the fans themselves, because fans don't just consume the myth. Fans perform it. That's the part that matters for the psychological angle of this video. When you give people a story about what something is, they start acting like that story is real. They dress like it. They behave like it. They go to concerts expecting it. And the expectation shapes the outcome. That doesn't mean every show becomes violent. It means the emotional volatility becomes part of the space. And even beyond the Stones, the pattern spreads. The Satanic Panic template becomes a cultural tool, not only for this band, but for future artists, future scenes, future music that scares adults. The Stones are not just one case. They become a prototype. The idea that music can be a gateway, that fame can be a ritual, that youth culture is a threat you have to contain. This is why the line in your title matters. The moment their myth turned dangerous. The myth was always dangerous, just not in the way people thought. It wasn't dangerous because the band had supernatural power. It was dangerous because it taught a society how to turn fear into action. It taught people how to treat a story as a reason to punish. It taught institutions how to respond to anxiety with control. And it taught crowds how to transform entertainment into a stage for collective emotion. Sometimes beautiful, sometimes destructive. Now, here's the part we need to land before the final section. What did the Stones actually do with the myth after it became a liability? How did they survive being turned into a symbol of corruption? How did they manage the tension between legend and responsibility? And the answer is not clean, because surviving a myth often means learning to live inside it, not defeating it, not disproving it, just outlasting it. That's what makes the last chapter of this story so chilling, because the legacy is not simply that the Stones kept touring and kept being famous. The legacy is that the culture learned something. It learned that you can manufacture a monster out of a band. You can build a public enemy out of aesthetics and rumors. And once the monster exists, it can shape behavior, shape policy, and shape real outcomes. In the final section, we close this file the way we opened it, not as a music story, but as a case study in mass psychology. And we leave you with one question you can't unhear. If a myth can do this to the Rolling Stones, what does it do to artists who don't have the power to fight back? When people look back on the Rolling Stones, they often argue about music, about albums, eras, performances, legends. But the real story we've been tracing is not a discography. It's a blueprint for how a culture turns anxiety into a monster, and then uses that monster to explain the parts of change it doesn't want to understand. Because the most important thing to recognize is this. The Stones did not become dangerous because a headline said so. They became dangerous in the way a symbol becomes dangerous. Not by casting spells, but by shaping behavior. By pulling millions of people into a shared emotional narrative and letting that narrative grow so big it started affecting how crowds acted, how institutions planned, and how the public interpreted reality. That is the core lesson of satanic panic. It is not a belief system. It is a social mechanism. It takes fear that already exists and gives it target. It takes confusion and turns it into certainty. It takes complicated questions and answers them with a villain. And once a villain is chosen, everything becomes evidence. A lyric is a confession. An album cover is a warning sign. A party rumor becomes proof. A tragic incident becomes a verdict. Even silence becomes suspicious. This is why panic is so hard to stop, because it makes itself feel moral. It makes itself feel protective. It convinces normal people that their outrage is a form of responsibility. The Rolling Stone story shows you how that mechanism can escalate. It starts as edgy branding and cultural discomfort. It grows into headlines and rumors. It moves into institutions, security planning, and public pressure. And then, when one real tragedy occurs, the myth becomes anchored. From that point on, the fear no longer needs imagination. It has a memory. Altamont was not the proof of supernatural evil. It was the proof of something more human and more frightening. It was the proof that expectation shapes reality. That crowds don't arrive empty. They arrive programmed by stories. And when a story says danger, the room becomes more dangerous. So the reveal in this file is not that the Stones were secretly evil. The reveal is that hysteria can take a band's mythology and turn it into real-world consequences. That's why the phrase "the moment their myth turned dangerous" is so accurate. The myth wasn't dangerous because it was true. It was dangerous because people acted like it was true. And that is the part that should stay with you. Because once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. In the way media frames public enemies. In the way communities demand protection from things they barely understand. In the way institutions respond to fear with control. In the way a crowd can become a single organism that moves on belief rather than fact. The Rolling Stones survived because they were massive, because they had money, lawyers, influence, and cultural gravity. They could outlast the wave. They could keep moving. They could keep performing. They could become bigger than the myth by simply staying alive long enough for the culture to get distracted by the next panic. But what about the artists who weren't that big? What about the people who got swallowed by the myth and didn't have the spotlight to push back? That's the real reason this story matters. Because it's not a one-off scandal. It's a pattern that turns art into evidence and turns fear into a weapon. And one last thought before we close this one. The most dangerous thing about the Rolling Stones was never the music. It was what fear made people do when they believed a story. And once the culture learns that fear is profitable, it doesn't stop. It evolves. It gets smarter. It gets packaged. It becomes a blueprint. Because the next file isn't about a band becoming a symbol by accident. It's about an artist who turned outrage into armor. An artist who watched the bands, the moral panic, the religious fury, and realized something terrifying. If they're going to call you a threat anyway, you can weaponize the label and become untouchable. This time, the scandal isn't a tragedy that the myth latches onto. It's a strategy. Madonna, band videos, Catholic outrage, and the scandal blueprint that made her untouchable.